God dag alle sammen! God dag! Så godt å se så mange folk her. Vakker dag. The day is so nice that if we make mistakes up here, you will just forgive us. Yeah. Welcome to our 13th anniversary service, the one we devote to the remembering the U.S.-Dakota War of 1862 that reached this area on the 20th of August. Yes?
Better known as the Sioux Uprising.
Well, that's another common word for it, yeah. Sioux Uprising. Well, thank you so much for coming. Your folders, I think we printed 125, so hopefully there's enough for everybody. And there's an insert that shows on one side a map, and another side a list of the folks that spent 1 or 2 or 3 nights at the Isle of Refuge. So you'll be hearing about that as we go along. Let's start, if we can, by standing and singing the Norwegian national anthem, followed by the Star Spangled Banner. And the flags, as you know, are probably off to your right. Yeah. Ja, vi älskar detta landet som vi stiger fram. Förut over landet ner i 1000 järn. Älskar oss i väg och tänker på far och mor. Och det slagen land som sänker drömmer vår Okay, Gene Urban. Oh, say can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose bright stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof to the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave? Thank you. Please be seated. You all sound so good, we'll have to sing some more later on. Now I'd like to call on our Master of Ceremonies, Chief Narrator, Jeff Johnson.
Thanks, Earl. Can you all hear me in the back? Or do I step back a little ways? There we go. Hi, my name is Jeff Johnson. Grew up here in the community. Some of you all know who I am. Those of you that you don't, I hope to get to meet you a little later on yet today. We've put together a little bit of a reader's theater, and I really hope you enjoy it, so bear with us. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. No, today we are not reading A Tale of Two Cities, though our conversation today is about the good times prior to August 20th, 1862, for the new settlers here in the new land, and about the bad times that were soon to come. The year was 1862. It was likely a day just like today, 150 years ago. Perhaps a little bit warm with the breeze. The Scandinavian settlers had been here in this area for 1 or 2 and maybe some cases up to 3 years. Up until this time, they had had relatively innocent encounters with the Metawakanton Band of the Dakota. If you had the opportunity to attend our Readers Theater in May, you would have heard how promises were made and broken, and how hunger and distrust was building in the Minnesota River Valley 60 miles or so to the south. Nonetheless, no one expected what was about to happen, just 4 miles west of this very spot near Munson Lake. Our place is not to try to explain why things happened as they did, nor is it to find that someone is at fault. Rather, it is simply to provide a chance for each of us to become better educated about what did happen 150 years ago, and to learn a little bit about what it was like to live on the edge of civilization. We hope that we will be successful. We want to welcome each of you today to our Readers Theater. I'll be introducing several people throughout the presentation. At the end, we'll have a brief time for questions, and you can certainly feel free to visit with the presenters afterwards. We'll have a little coffee, maybe a little lunch, just a light little lunch. Before we begin, though, the main program, in keeping with our humble Norwegian beginnings, will be favored with a solo in Norsk by a young man that some of you may all know. Eric Huddlestead grew up just down the road from the sign declaring that out there lies the Isle of Refuge, and probably walked in the same pastures as those settlers as they tried to gain refuge on the island. Please, Eric, will you sing Vilken vän vi har i Jesus? What a friend we have in Jesus for us today. Oh, right here then?
Oh, okay. Vilken vän vi har i Jesus, allt han vet och allt förmår. Tyngste bidre han oss lätter, når i bund till ham vi går. Ak, men tid for fred forstyrres, så mye blir volden. Blott fordi vi ikke bringer alle ting til ham i bønn. Blir du fristet eller prøvet, synes livets kamp deg hård. Aldri skal du miste motet, når i bønn til Gud du går. Selv om kjærest venn deg svikter, aldri svikter deg Guds synd. Han alene kan du trøste, tal til ham om alt i bønn. Har ditt hjerte fullt av uro, tro du trengslet forestår. Jesus er den beste tilflukt, når til ham i bønn du går. Kan en sådan venn du finne, som Guds egen kjære sønn, bar i gleden som i sorgen, alle ting til ham i bønn.
Thanks, Eric. You notice he's hurrying and scurrying off and won't even stay to sign autographs. Because he hurried down here from his one job and now he's on his way back to his other job. So we thank him very kindly for coming and sharing that wonderful voice with us. Thanks, Eric. Before we get too far along here, I wanted just to show you a couple things on a map, just so you have some idea of the perspective of where things lie in relationship to where we are. Right here you have what's called today Munson Lake. 150 years ago, this was the West Lake settlements. These were the cabins and the settlers that were along that side of the lake. That's about 4 miles from here. And then that's about 3 or 4 miles from here. And then if you notice over here, you have Ole Knutsen. That's Ole Knutsen's cabin, and that's located right over here in the trees, just to the right of where I'm standing, to your left. And then another 2 miles away, you see Railsons and you see Norway Lake. So the distance from Munson Lake to Norway Lake to the Island Refuge was somewhere in the neighborhood of 5, 6, 7 miles, depending upon which way you went around the sloughs. So today you're going to have an opportunity to hear in words of the settlers that lived along these lakes and that came here from Norway and Sweden that 150 years ago, what occurred on August 20th. You'll also hear a little bit about the interactions between the Dakota and the Scandinavians in those years that occurred prior to the uprising or to the Dakota Wars. Please understand that you may have heard it differently from your grandparents, and you may have heard it differently from your neighbor, and then what you might be hearing it from us. And that's kind of the way history works. You know, history sometimes gets passed down generation to generation by stories, and as it transfers, sometimes things change a little bit in the telling. So we're doing the best that we can. Sometimes these written formats may not have been gone to writing for 85 years. Well, think about that. If you're trying to remember 85 years and you've told a story 15 times each year for 85 years, it can change. But we do the best we can, and so you take the words for what they are. But more importantly is for you to feel the impact of what the words say to you as this happens. We're going to introduce each of the presenters as we go along, and we want to thank you for being here today. So with that, we'll keep going. Years ago, there was a gentleman named Eben Lawson who wrote for the Wilmer paper. Now, many of you that lived in this area at some time in your life have read some of those stories, and you've been able to laugh at the drawings that he made. And he had stories about all kinds of things, from ice fishing and finding dogs in the muskrats in the fish house to what went on in the different parts of the county. Mostly examples of pioneer life here in this community. And at that time, this was known as Norway Lake Parish, or Norway Lake Settlement. And to the west was the West Lake Settlement. Even though the lake was Munson Lake, it was still called West Lake Settlement. And down to the south was West Lake, where there wasn't a settlement. So we get that straight, pretty soon we'll be in good shape. But this was all part of Monongalia County. The northern half of Kaneohe County was Monongalia County. It was not Kaneohe County at that time. One of the early residents that settled here were Thomas and Birgitte Osmundson. They came here, I believe, in the fall of 58 or 59. They enjoyed numerous pleasurable outings, numerous pleasurable encounters with the Dakota peoples that were hunting and fishing here on or near Norway Lake. The area here was replete with game and with fish. And even today, if you think about it, as you go out on Norway and Lake Andrew and Lake Florida, who are a lot of the people that you see on the lake, but still people coming from Redwood Falls and the Minnesota River Valley. So we still have a reputation of that same wild game attitude up here. Today we're honored to have with us Hazel Niedermuller. She's the great-great-granddaughter of Thomas and Birgitte Osmundson, and she'll speak a little bit about some of the times that were written by Eben Lawson.
Good afternoon. It's fun to be here. I'm going to be reading 3 stories about the Indians that shared with my great-great-grandfather. Indian showed his appreciation. Back in the pioneer days, there were used to come a small band of Indians that camped every season on the south side of Norway Lake. Their camp was generally located just east of Thomas Osmundson's claim, about where the J.S. Christensen farm is now located. As a consequence, Mr. Osmundson had many stories to tell of his contact with the dusky neighbors. In fact, it seemed that he became on a very friendly terms with them. One incident that he used to tell about was when the chief came over to borrow his rifle. It seemed that the Indians knew that there were numerous elk in the north, Lake Colfax, but they did not have enough, were not able to shoot any. They put the blame on their poor luck and their inferior guns. So one day, one of the Indians came over and explained the situation. Mr. Osmundson told him to put in more powder when he loaded his gun, but the Indian shook his head. No good, no good. He wanted to borrow Osmundson's gun. The Indians had dealt honestly with him before, so he didn't hesitate to let them have the rifle. The first day, they shot one elk. The second day, they shot another, and on the next, they killed the third. That was all they wanted. The day following, the Indian returned the rifle. When he did so, he brought Osmundson a hind quarter of venison off one of the elks and also left 2 pairs of moccasins, nicely decorated with beads. As he left the rifle, he patted it and said, "Good gun, good gun." Second story is Brought Back the Sack. Osmund Osmundson, among the first settlers of Norway Lake settlement, and of whom we have already told several stories, seems to have been, according to his son Gunther, on very good terms with the Sioux. He had another story that he used to tell about the Indians. One day, a band of Indians that were camping near the Osmundson farm came over and wanted flour, for which he offered to pay them with fur. The transaction was made, but the Indian had nothing to take the flour in. So it was agreed that he could take the flour in a wheat sack and bring back the sack later. There came an early storm in November of that year, and the Indians broke camp immediately and left for their homes up north. The next summer, the Indians came back to Norway Lake again. They had done in the preceding years. Osmundson had forgotten all about the sack. One day, while he was cradling wheat, 3 Indians came over. Then one of them handed back the sack. They had not forgotten. This is my third last story. Indian honesty. Thomas Osmundson with his family lived in Norway Lake settlement for nearly 4 years before the Indian outbreak. His homestead was in Section 8 of Lake Andrew Township on the south shore of Norway Lake, a place commonly known as the Chris Solberg Farm. Every spring, there used to come a band of 8 or 9 Indians and camp on the shore of the lake on the land of John Torkelson Totland, who also located in the locality of, in 1958, a neighbor of Osmundson on the east. These Indians had their main headquarters further north, where the tribe lived, probably in the neighborhood of Leech Lake. And when winter approached, they would break camp and return north. This was not uncommon even after the outbreak. We can well remember as a boy how an outfit of Indians used to come and camp on the north shore of Green Lake, even into the 80s. Osmundson never had any trouble with the Indians prior to the outbreak. He used to tell incidents connected with these Indians. Even a small band as these were organized to the extent that they even had a chief. One day, this chief came over to Osmundson's place and asked to borrow an auger, his intention being to build them a sled like those the settlers had. Mr. Osmundson, however, did not have an auger large enough in size, but he suggested to the Indian that he might secure one from Even Railson, who lived further to the west. The Indian went to Mr. Railson and stated his errand. Railson said he would loan one of them inasmuch as Osmundson had sent him over. He would also be good for the auger's return. The Indian came back to Osmundson and told him that what Railson had said. Osmundson took a piece of paper, addressed it to Railson, and stated that he would be good for the return of the tool in question. The Indian then returned to Railson with the guarantee and got the auger. Some days later, the Indian came to Osmund to show him that the auger was intact. Then he returned to Railson's. Railson looked it over and said, "Good, all right." But the Indian shook his head. He wanted the guarantee paper back again. Railson complied. Even then, the Indian was not satisfied. He wanted Railson to write the satisfaction on the back of the paper. This also Railson did. The Indian then returned to Osmundson and handed him the slip of paper back again.
It was not only Eben Lawson who wrote down some of the events and stories that would be passed on from generation to generation. Sometimes we ought to be telling our children and grandchildren more stories and spending a lot less time on video games. There are still those amongst us who do tell great stories. Douglas Glesney, great-grandson of Evan and Corey Glesney, from just north of here, is such a fine storyteller. I have heard when he recited this next story that he'll tell us to a group of Norwegians that he nearly brought them to tears. But you can be the judge of that yourself. As Douglas will fortelle den of de mange historien at han hørte fra hans besteforeldre, he'll tell one of the many stories that he has heard from his grandparents.
Well, my great-grandfather Evan Glesney came to America from Norway in 1848 when he was 12 years old with his parents. And they lived in Brown County, Wisconsin. And in 1860, Evan Glesney and Evan Railson, who were cousins, came to Norway Lake and homesteaded. One day, Evan was out cutting hay with a scythe. There was a large hay meadow south of his homestead, which I remember before it was ever plowed up. And he was out there cutting hay with a scythe. And a great-grandma was home alone, one-room log cabin. She had a little baby, Christine, and Christine was in a little basket on the floor. Well, she had just baked 7 loaves of bread, and just like that, there stood 3 Indian bucks in the doorway of the cabin. They were conversing, but of course she couldn't understand them, and she was kind of scared, but she tried not to show that. And anyway, they were talking amongst themselves, and then there was a brown jug sitting in the corner of the log cabin, and they pointed to that jug. So she went over and took the jug up, took the cork out of it, and tipped it upside down and showed them that it was empty. She figured they probably thought it was moonshine or something. There was nothing in the jug. So then they were still conversing, and so she went over and she got 3 loaves of bread and gave them. And then the one Indian went to the basket where the baby was. She got frantic. She thought, they're going to steal my baby. And he picked the baby up and then just monkeyed with the baby's feet and put the baby Christy and put her back down in the basket. And they all left. They took the bread and left. 3 days later, a squaw came back with a pair of moccasins for the baby to show the appreciation for the bread. So that's just one of many stories that have been handed down to me since I was a small child. Thank you.
These good times were not going to last. The Swedish families living near Munson Lake were some of the first to feel the ravages of the rebelling Indians. The only survivor of the Anders P. Broberg family was Anna Stina Broberg. Anna dictated this memoir when she was 81 years old, the memoir that you're about to hear. She was born in Skafta, Västergötland, Sweden in July of 1846, making her 16 at the time that the Indians came. Anna Stina had written that the government had wanted to place the Indians on a reservation and had reached an agreement with them. However, the ratification of the treaty took years, and the Indians revolted when the value was set too low by the government and that the land that the government was purchasing. Playing a major role in this was also the fact that food for most of them living in the Minnesota River Valley was extremely short, and many were starving. Bringing her words to life, we have Carol Lundquist, widow of John Lundquist, who was a great-grandson of Evan and Corey Glesney and great-great-grandson of Andreas and Lena Lundberg. The photograph that you see here is Anastina Broberg.
Paul Lundborg this morning mentioned that in his sermon how we remember bad things for a long time, and I think this is evidence of that. Anastina wrote, on Wednesday, August 20th, 1862, the white settlers gathered at the A. Lundborg house where services were being held. About 12 o'clock, Peter Broberg, 7 years old, came and warned us that he had seen some very savage Indians coming from the deep Broberg cabin and going toward the meeting house, but had done no harm to Andrew Peter Broberg. As my father returned home, he and my cousin Alfred, 5 years old, were killed in the cook shanty by a gun, and my brothers were killed in the woods by a tomahawk. Louis Lundborg, that's Lars Lundborg, after noticing the Indians wearing their war clothes, ran for home. As he jumped the fence on A.P. Broberg's farm, he was shot dead. The rest of the Lundborg boys were killed near the Broberg place, and also Uncle John Nelson. Old man Lundborg saw his son Louis fall and turned homeward, while 2 Indians took after him and fired at him, but didn't hit him. He had a gun, and they didn't dare to come too close. He met D.P. Broberg with the ox team with his wife and baby and his son Peter. Also Mrs. Andrew Broberg, Christina, and myself went along. We women jumped out. The Indians overtook my mother and shook hands with her. She refused to go with them. Then they shot her down. They took after my sister and me, knocked my sister down with the gun, and then turned back to my mother, but she was dead. My sister got up to run, but was overtaken again and killed. The Indians went back to the wagon where Uncle D.P. Broberg was. As they killed Uncle, Peter and his mother jumped out of the wagon. She wanted Peter to run to Lundborg's, but he ran to Oman's instead. His mother and little baby brother were killed. The baby was cut up. Pieces were cut from face and nose and legs inside of the mother. I caught up with old man Lundborg and went to his home. 2 Indians being left went to Swen Oman's house where the family had hid in the cellar. The Indians came through the window and knocked the dishes to pieces, also taking a large chest which had been brought over from Sweden and accidentally placed it over the cellar door, then left the house. Peter Broberg cried while in the cellar because he was afraid the Indians would find him. They stayed in the cellar until nearly dark. When they came out, seeing no Indians around, they went to the brush and camped overnight. Next morning, a number of people set out for our place to look for living things. Mr. John Lundborg, 2 women, 3 children, and myself went to hide in the grass near a small lake about 2 miles away. 7 Indians were heading our way. They happened to notice Mr. A. Lundborg and Ole Svensson and took after them. In all, they shot 16 shots at Mr. Lundborg and never touched him. They didn't dare to get too near him, for he had a gun. This he couldn't use because the gun and ammunition were wet. It had rained all night long. When the 7 gave up the shooting at A. Lundborg, they noticed other settlers stacking grain of hay and made for their home. 2 pointed guns at the men settlers. 2 others approached them and asked for white men's ponies, while the other 3 held their own ponies. They took the whites' horses and went away, not killing any of the settlers. They must have been out of ammunition. They proceeded to our homes and loaded up all the goods that they could steal and carry away. We lay in the grass from 12 noon until sundown. We then made up our minds to go to Ole Knutsen's. As we started to walk, we noticed 2 men coming on horseback, whom we feared were Indians. We went out in the lake again and hid in the grass. Finally, they came so close that we could hear our names called. They were Mr. Lundborg and a neighbor who had been hunting for us. We went to Ole Knutsen's, where we stayed overnight. During the evening, John Lundborg went home to see if he could find anyone. He happened to see his brother Sam on the prairie, who called to him, but thinking him an Indian, did not answer. Sam was 9 and had been shot and carried a bullet in his side for the rest of his life. They found him in the morning. he had left for the woods and met Omans who were on their way to Norway Lake. We all made our camp on an island there. On the morning of the 21st, only the dead were found. No Indians were around. On Friday, the 22nd, we buried the dead. Saturday, we were to leave for Painesville, but got only off the island when we heard Mr. Osmondson call that 7 Indians came from his cellar and shot at him. He called, "Hurry up, boys. Here are 7 savages. If you can't come, I can shoot them all." The Indians became frightened and ran. We returned to the island for refuge again. While chasing the Indians, they found 4 white children whose father had been killed. Their mother had come the day before to the island with 2 small children, but the Indians took one as a prize and left the mother and the other child unharmed. While they looked around, they saw more people coming from the north, but discovered they were white and friends to us all. She goes on just to sum up that they went to Painesville, the refugees, the survivors, stayed there for 2 or 3 weeks, went to St. Cloud with some difficulty, and ended up, most of them, in St. Paul, Washington County, Acton over there, and then scattered many to Carver County, the Lundborgs in particular, to Carver County, where they had other relatives, fortunately. And they were gone for until 1866, till after the war, 1866 or late 1865, we're not sure. That's Honestina's story. Powerful stuff.
As we well know, the church and the music associated with it played a very important role in the life of these early settlers from Norway and Sweden. Garrison Keeler says, "I once sang the bass line of Children of the Heavenly Father in a room with about 3,000 Lutherans in it. And when we finished, we all had tears in our eyes. Partly from the promise that God will not forsake us, and partly from the proximity of all those lovely voices. By our joining in harmony, we somehow promise that we will not forsake each other." We will sing now, I think Jean will accompany us on the piano, the first 3 verses of Children of Our Heavenly Father. Look at her.
2 or 3?
3?
Okay.
Yeah, there's
If
6
a
total.
program too.
Yeah, that's okay, but there's
Okay.
6 total.
Yep.
I found that out today on the internet.
All right. Okay.
When the killings began at Munson Lake, the settlers had to do something. These were farmers, not soldiers, but they knew they were not safe where they were. You heard earlier in Anastina's account about going to the Knutsen cabin, which was occupied by Norwegians, Ole and Asa Knutsen. They had not been here in the new land quite so long, but had built a very solid cabin. Here's this. I'll show you here. This is the view out of the front door of that cabin. If those of y'all who have not been here, what you see in this picture, if you look to the trees in the very far distance, That's the Engen Woods just before you get to West Norway Lake. So you can see how far they could go, and you can see why they built their cabin where they did. That cabin is just east of here. You're all invited to stop there as you're able. Once we're done here, it's open. Please go in. There's pictures of how it was rebuilt. To tell us his grandfather's recollections of those days, we have Earl Knudsen. Earl, what can you and Gene Hagen tell us about the important role of the cabin during that first day of the war?
I'll find my script. This is from an interview of Great-Grandpa Ole done in 1913, so it's also 100 years old, and it's his recollections of something that happened 50 years earlier. He says, Pastor Jackson, a missionary in the area, came on that date to hold services at Mr. A. Lundberg's house. The minister said he had heard that Indians had plundered and killed 3 men at Afton, but he thought it was a false story. He started the services. At a neighboring farm there were 2 small boys who stayed home when the grown-ups went to the services. A flock of Indians came to those small boys wanting food. The boys ran up to the church services and said that there were treacherous-looking Indians at their home wanting food. 3 of Lundberg's sons volunteered to investigate and wanted to take guns along, but the minister said he thought it would be better if they didn't have any weapons. The others at the meeting went with their oxen hitched up to their wagons. Mr. Lundberg went after his sons and had a gun along. He got there just in time to see the oldest and youngest of his sons killed by Indians. When they saw the people in the wagons, some of them walking, they set after them and killed most of them. Mr. Lundberg then had to turn around, pursued by Indians, but escaped and went to warn the settlers further east. Knudsen was out cutting hay when Lundberg made him aware of the danger. Lundberg already had been at Knudsen's house, and he told Knudsen that he didn't have to go home because his family had either gone into hiding or headed east. Ole went home anyway and found his house empty. He looked around the woods for his family. He went as far as even Railson Glesney's farm, but found that house empty also. Then he went back towards home. Looked closer. He found the tracks and finally found his family in a very thick grove of trees. They had heard us shout the first time, but they were afraid there were Indians nearby, so they didn't dare answer. They set out for Railson's house, but it was deserted. Some people thought of an island in the east part of Norway Lake. If they could get there without being seen, they would be safe, or at least be able to protect themselves because the land was surrounded by water. But how could they get over when they didn't have a boat? When they reached the lake, there were other people there. They made a canoe by hollowing out a log, a linden tree, which they caulked at both ends. But there was only room for one beside that one that paddled. Ole stationed 3 men with sharp shooting guns to guard if the Indians should come, but the Indians did not come. When everyone had made it to the island, they sent out 6 men to search for several who were missing. They divided into 2 groups and were fortunate enough to find most of the people that they were looking for. Once they almost shot at the people they were trying to rescue, thinking they were Indians. They went to Knudsen's home to stay there overnight, but one insisted on going back to the island that evening. Ole sent some blankets and as much food as he could carry with them, so that at least the children would get something to eat. Knudsen had 2 children. He and his wife carried them in their arms, and they went to the lake. Right here. Yeah.
The group stayed on the island for 3 days, but the grown-ups had been back to the mainland and buried 13 dead. Their destination now was Painesville. On the 4th day, they began their march, but not before Ole went along with an old man, Mr. Broberg, to search for his wife who was lost. Mr. Broberg mourned terribly for his loss. Ole found some of his cattle and also a pair of oxen, which he hurriedly hooked up to a wagon. He gathered up all he could take along. The other cattle followed him willingly just as they knew what was going on. After they came back to the lake and were loaded up ready to go as intended to Painesville, they got a signal from the guard at the top of the hill that danger was coming. The guards had seen a group coming from the west. They hastily moved everyone back to the island. 2 people on horses were sent out to find out if it was Indians. If so, they were to try to lead them away from the refugees. Fortunately, there was a group of whites sent out from Painesville to help and to rescue when it was needed. They were escorted through the woods and out on the prairie where they spent the night. They arrived at Painesville the next day. In a short story, one cannot tell all the details and events, but still we will tell a little bit about one family who lived 3 miles south of Norway. Since, besides giving an illustration of death and destruction, it also shows how slowly we let go of the mundane, as it was with that woman. After seeing her husband murdered, she and her children were rescued. In a minute, she tried to salvage the possessions which could be salvaged. Her husband was out cutting hay when the Indians came and shot him. They then came to the house where his wife and children were. And among these was a 17-year-old girl whom the Indians wanted to take as captive. They took her and tied her to a horse, but she screamed and frightened, so the horse ran away. After a neck-breaking ride, she finally fell off. The horse ran out in the prairie in circles. The Indians set their attention on the horse, but seemed to forget about the girl. She hid in the grass until dark. She then went back to find 2 of her younger siblings. With them, she went to Sven Borgen, whom they knew. When they got there, the place was deserted. She went further and finally met the people who were headed for Painesville. When the children saw people, they ran and hid in the grass, but they were found by those who were riding horses. Their mother and the other children had left home after the Indians had mishandled the mother and tore most of her clothing off. They had not killed her and the children as they usually did. It must have been the affair with the girl and the horse that confused them, because they didn't want to lose the horse. The mother and children were sighted out in the prairie and were taken to the island. After they came to safety on the island, the mother ardently told about the event and how she had escaped. She demanded that the men go and see after their things at home, and finally get Johannes dug down, because the wolf might come and eat him up. You will need a spade, and you will find it in the bark shanty. Johannes is lying by the creek, because that is where he was cutting hay. You have to take the scythe home and hang it in the big tree in front of the house, and you must put the grindstone well into the brush behind the house. When they left, because they couldn't pay so much attention to so much instruction, she shouted after them, "You must bring the whetstone, which he most likely has in his pocket, where he used to carry it." There was more, but they were tired of listening. When they got to the woods, Indians shot at them, so they had to come back, and Johannes was buried a few days later by a volunteer group from Painesville, but we don't know if they found the whetstone.
The recollections continue. We also want to say something about a younger son of Mr. Broberg, whom the Indians shot in the side and he fell. To make sure he was dead, they hit him over the chest with a gun butt. He wasn't dead, but he had enough sense to pretend that he was. So we saw how they pillaged everything. They took everything they could, some cattle, a yoke of oxen, which they hooked up to the wagon that they had loaded up. Since they didn't know how to drive the oxen ran away with the wagon and left the Indians behind. When the Indians left, the boy struggled up and was able to make it over to Knudson's. It was the day that Knudsen returned, so he took the boy with him to the island. The boy recovered and is still living, but will always suffer from the shot. Thomas A. Osmundson went to his house with horse and wagon to take what he could of his things. Sven Borgen was with him, and when they came to the house, 8 Indians came out and started to shoot at them. Osmundson had a gun in the wagon, but he got so excited he couldn't get it up in time. He hollered as loud as he could, so they could hear him on the island. The others heard him and hollered back as loud as they could. The Indians got scared and ran off as fast as they could towards the north end of the lake where they had their horses. The settlers had a conference on whether they should pursue the Indians or leave them well enough alone, and they chose to do the latter. The families of Anders Peder and Daniel Broberg suffered most from the massacre. All were killed except a little boy at Daniel's and a girl at Anders Peder's. The boy is now a merchant in New London, and the girl is married and lives in the area. When they left the lake, they stayed 3 days in Painesville. The town was full of people coming in from the whole area. Mr. Broberg arrived, and my informant tells me that it was great to see those old people rejoicing over meeting someone after each thought the other was dead. The people in Painesville tried as hard as they could to get the people to stay and return to their homes later, but the refugees had decided to go elsewhere. First they went to Richmond, where they met many from Sauk River. They remained a couple of days and went on to St. Cloud. Primitive measures had been made to resist attack if the Indians should come. The people of St. Cloud did not want to let them go any further and denied them the use of the ferry. There was no bridge. It went so far that the mayor and the sheriff met them at the ferry and would not let them pass. But the mixed regiment with old guns, hay forks, and clubs would not take orders. They cut the ferry loose, and the sheriff's people did not dare to stop them with all the weapons they had. The cattle were driven into the river. Thomas Osmundson had trained his oxen to be ridden. He jumped on the ox's back and went into the river. When it was too deep to reach bottom, the ox swam, and the rest of the herd followed willingly. Later on their way, they met soldiers who had some Chippewa Indians with them. The Chippewa Indians were old enemies of the Sioux, and the Chippewa were going west to fight the Sioux under leadership of the U.S. soldiers. On the way to St. Paul and Minneapolis, they camped outside of towns. People came to bring them food and clothes that they lacked. At the end, they spread out into different directions. Knudsen went to Rice County and stayed there for 4 years. Knudsen went back to see about his land and to report at the land office so that he wouldn't lose title to it. In the fall of 1866, they moved back with horses, wagons, oxen, and a little money. The immigrants started to stream in, and in a couple of years, the land in Kanuhai County was all occupied.
For those of you who do not know, this is the Isle of Refuge. From somewhat the location of Thomas Osmundson's cabin, looking across. So it wasn't so far across they paddled that two-person dugout canoe. But it was still important that that was far enough away that they felt safe. At least 60 people, we believe 60, I think on your list you see 61 were on the island at one given time. Once the war ended, the government determined that reparations should be made by the Dakota. In order to do that, it was necessary for the white survivors to file affidavits attesting to their losses that they had suffered at the hands of the Indians. I would guess that you could equate them to the victim impact statements that are in use by the courts of today. From the Dakota Victims 1862 website, I quote, "Depredation claims were filed by nearly 3,000 settlers after the uprising for losses and damages. These documents are priceless as they give first-hand slices of the life of our ancestors. These claims itemize the losses of their cabins, crops, animals, tools, clothes, and many of their irreplaceable family possessions." End quote. One such affidavit was that of Lena Lundberg, sworn to on August 23rd, 1862, which would have only been 3 or 4 days after the battles had occurred. So with that, Carol Lundquist will read that affidavit.
The affidavit is actually dated the next day, Thursday evening, August 21st. So it's in Painesville, which gives you an idea of the short amount of time it took them to get to Painesville. Lena Lundborg was married to Andreas Lundborg. The day before, she had seen her 3 sons killed and the Brobergs. She had laid in the woods, according to the family stories, all night long in the rain, possibly in a tree. The next day, she was found by Even Olsen Glesney, Doug's great-grandfather, and my husband's great-grandfather also. My husband has deep roots in Candy, Ojai County. And this is a copy of the affidavit. The original is at the Minnesota Historical Society, and we accidentally found reference to it in a book, and I got copies of it. And there's not much punctuation. I'm going to read it as it was taken that day. Lena Lundborg affidavit. It's the only testimony we have from anybody in the Lundborg family as to what happened on the 20th. So it's like Augustina's account. It's quite special. Lena Lundborg affidavit. At a meeting held in Painesville on Thursday Eve, August 21st, 1862, J.B. Pease, Esquire, was appointed chairman and E.E. Payne, secretary. The object of the meeting being stated to ascertain the facts in regard to Indians killing certain persons near Norway Lake. Mrs. Lena Lundborg stated that she attended a meeting on Wednesday, August 20th, at her house near Norway Lake, held by Reverend Andrew Jackson, that when the meeting was about half out, Andrew Peter Broberg, of course, came to said meeting and told them that some 20 Indians were in their house and more coming, said house being about 2 miles off. That is the Andrew Peter is the 7-year-old Broberg, the only survivor in that family of Brobergs. His father, mother, sister, brothers were killed, and he's 7. When 6 of Lundborg's family and 4 Brobergs started home, or to said house, that she with others started home from meeting and met or saw 2 Indians while at her house shoot Mrs. Christine Broberg, and saw an Indian raise a gun to strike, and saw Mrs. Christine Broberg fall. That about half an hour Mr. Lundborg came and told her that their son Louis was shot by the Indians, and he did not know what had become of the rest of their boys. And then there's some of this is illegible, were then all started, I'm not sure what that means, and saw 1 Indian in the road. She hid in the grass when she heard 7 or 8 shots fired. Mrs. Lundborg lay in the woods alone all night and came to Louis Olson's about noon Wednesday. That can't be right, it must be Thursday, and came to Painesville. Mrs. Lena Lundborg, being duly sworn, says the above statement is true according to the best of her knowledge. JBP's JP. Lena Lundborg signed it herself, and E.E. Payne was the witness. Now that is an amazing document. In the voice of Lena. Thank you.
I think this would be a real fine time to sing the final 3 voices that we started with, and we will also pass some offering plates around this time. Is that correct, Earl?
That's right.
So
We live on donations.
So the words are in front of you for those of that you can see this far up. Thank you, Gene. Thanks for the singing. Thanks for the offering. Is it still going around? We can proceed? We can. During the next several days, extreme anxiety and fear plagued the settler refugees, soon to number 60 or more. Reports were coming in from other cabins in the county of more death and fighting. As we said before, these were farmers, not soldiers, but at the same time, they were not helpless. They came from good Viking stock, from places like Valdres and Hardangerfjord, Norway, Västergötland, Sweden, and they had not gotten to this wild place in the middle of Minnesota by being afraid or by not having common sense and a steady wit about them. Nonetheless, they also knew not how many Indians there were, and they, the settlers, were likely ill prepared to fight an extended battle. They determined that they needed to get to another safer place, like St. Cloud or St. Paul. Another historian of that time was Gabriel Steeny, who wrote many articles for the Wilmer Tribune from 1925 to 1927, as well as obituaries for many of the settlers. We hear today a sampling of articles read by Hazel Niedermuller. You will note that while some of the settlers returned, others never did come back to the area. This is probably the scene that they saw as they rode away, leaving the Knutson cabin, never to come back. Some of them, some to come back in 3 or 4 or 5 years.
After burying the 13 victims at New Sweden, Monsoon Lake, and after Thomas Osmundson had trimmed the grave of his mother, which was near the island, they spent the second night on the island. They dared take no more chances, and on the following day, with a few loaded wagons drawn by oxen, they left for Painesville and St. Cloud, driving their cattle before them. Among those in the cavern were the mother and 5 children who had left their husband and father dead, and who had seen their girl Mary carried off on the back of an Indian pony. The mother was sad but thankful that she had 5 of her children with her on the trail to safety. Arriving at St. Cloud after 3 days, they found only a ferry across the river. There had been no bridge built at that time. The St. Cloud people refused to ferry them over, but told them to bunch up and they would be safe. Mary Iverson, who had been carried off by the Indians, had escaped and had arrived at St. Cloud previously to the arrival of the caravan, and she joined her mother. That same day, a company of 100 men on horseback buried Iverson's body. These men were all from St. Cloud. When the St. Cloud people refused to ferry the caravan across the river, Thomas Osmundson, Borgen, how do you pronounce that? Sven Borgen. I'm learning my Norwegian. Gunder Svensson and others with a little fighting blood decided to fight it out with the St. Cloud bunch rather than take their chances with the Indians. But the St. Cloud bunch gave in and ferried across everything but the cattle. 3 men had left with the cattle, and Osmundson, who had an ox which he had broken to ride, decided to swim the cattle across. He finally coaxed the ox into the water, and the rest of the stock followed. The caravan then proceeded to St. Anthony Falls, where they separated. Mrs. Iverson and children went with the Railsons and a few others to Rice County. Hans, Peter, Nels, and Christian Peterson volunteered to go and fight the Indians. Sven Borgen and wife and son Gunther, Christian Egan, and Regnali and Osmundson went up Rice Creek to Monoman, where they found a little sawmill and a few cabins which had been deserted. There they decided to remain for the winter. 12 miles from Anonoka, also known as Friley Station. It was pretty late in the year to get winter feed for the stock, but they found a farmer up the river who told them he would give them grass if they wanted to from the marsh that he owned for 25 cents a load. Borgen and son Gunther purchased the scythe and went to work taking care not to step into the water holes. In 1854, Andrew Railson from Rice County hunted up Osmundson and asked them to go back to Norway Lake Country. and put up hay, with the intention of spending the winter there. Upon arriving there, Norway Lake, they found the country going through a terrible drought. Prairie fires in July had left the ground full of cracks wide enough to put your fist in. The so-called Norway Lake Slough was so dry they could cross it any place with a team. There was no hay to be had, and they had to return the colony back for another winter. In 1865, the entire colony went to Norway Lake. Fires had ruined everything. Cabins and stables had to be built anew. The only cabins now standing were those of Eric Kapperud and the Swenson and the Broberg cabin. The entire colony united in making dugouts and shacks and log stables and dugouts for the cattle. They were husky men, and because of the open winter, they could work in their shirt sleeves until February. The men worked in a gang, one job at a time. They started at Andrew Railson's and then to Osmundson, Halverson's, Borgens, Ingens, even Railson, Eric Kapperud, Oldie Knudsen, even Gleason's, Lars Iverson, and Hilgi Hilderud. They were all done when the snow came in February.
Done very well.
I was a Californian, not a Minnesotan.
As I stated earlier, history is not always... The war was not long as wars go, but it was also one that suffered many casualties on both sides. Many of the Dakota were captured were forced marched to Minneapolis, and then were interned at Fort Snelling. Once decisions were made and trials were held, they were placed on steamboats and taken down the Mississippi to St. Louis and up the Missouri to the Crow Agency near present-day Fort Thompson, South Dakota. They were forbidden to return to Minnesota, and if they did, they had a bounty placed on their head. Others were pursued across the Dakota prairies by U.S. soldiers. 303 Dakota were sentenced to death. However, all but 38 of these sentences were commuted by President Lincoln. Even so, 38 of them never moved to South Dakota, but were hung in the largest mass execution in U.S. history on that fateful day in Mankato. Some of the Dakota did in fact return to Minnesota and were subsequently killed, including Chief Little Crow. Much has been written and many stories told this year marking the 150th anniversary of the war. There have been articles in the local papers as well as in the Star Tribune. Healing services and activities are being held across the state from Flandreau and Pipestone to Nest Church in Acton, and later in Mankato and New Ulm. This matter has risen to such a level of importance that Minnesota Governor Dayton has seen fit to require all state offices to fly flags at half-staff. We too have honored that request for all who died. The governor also issued a proclamation that expresses his feelings on the matter. Today we hear John Henson of Elk River, formerly of Lake Andrew Township, recite that proclamation, that all may hear the words of Governor Dayton.
August 17, 1862 marked a terrible period in Minnesota's history. The first victims of the U.S. Dakota War of 1862 lost their lives on that day 150 years ago. The ensuing attacks and counterattacks killed hundreds more U.S. soldiers, Dakota braves, conniving traitors, and innocent people. Tragically, those deaths started a vicious cycle of hate crimes, which continued long after the war was ended. The events leading to those atrocities actually began before 1862. The United States government, through its agents in the new state of Minnesota, either persuaded, deceived, or forced the state's longtime inhabitants from Dakota and Ojibwe Indian tribes to give up their lands for promises of money, food, and supplies. Many of the government's promises were repeatedly broken. The displaced Dakota and Chippewa tribes watched newly arrived settlers claim the lands that had been theirs. They were denied their treaty payments of money and food, which resulted in starvation for many of their children and elderly, Often, when annuity payments did finally arrive, they were immediately plundered by some dishonest officials and traders. On August 17, 1862, a group of Dakota Braves attacked and killed 5 new settlers at Acton in Meeker County. The Dakota community was not unanimous in the decision to go to war. Some of them helped the settlers. Nonetheless, the war began. Atrocities were committed by combatants on both sides against combatants and non-combatants alike. Hundreds of people were killed. Many more Indians and immigrant lives were ruined, and the lives of Minnesotans were altered for the next 150 years. The war ended, but the attacks against innocent Indian children, women, and elderly continued. They were even encouraged by the governor of Minnesota. On September 9, 1862, Alexander Ramsey proclaimed, "Our course then is plain. The Sioux Indians of Minnesota must be exterminated, or driven forever beyond the borders of the state. They must be regarded and treated as outlaws. If any shall escape extinction, the wretched remnant must be driven beyond our borders, and our frontier garrisoned with a force sufficient to forever prevent their return." A Minnesota newspaper chimed in, "We have plenty of young men who would like no better fun than a good Indian hunt." I am appalled by Governor Ramsey's words and by his encouragement of vigilante violence against innocent people, and I repudiate them. I know that almost all Minnesotans living today would be just as revolted. The viciousness and violence which were commonplace 150 years ago in Minnesota are not accepted or allowed now. Yet hostile feelings do still exist between some Native Americans and their neighbors. Detestable acts are still perpetrated by members of one group against the other. Present grievances added to past offenses make it difficult to commemorate the past, yet not continue it. I call for tomorrow, the 150th anniversary of August 17, 1862, to be a day of remembrance and reconciliation in Minnesota. I ask everyone to remember that dark past, to recognize its continuing harm in the present, and to resolve that we will not let it poison the future. To everyone who lost family members during that time, I offer my deepest condolences for your losses. I ask you especially to help lead us to better attitudes and actions toward others. To honor the American soldiers, Dakota people, and settlers who lost their lives in that war, I order that all state flags be flown at half-staff from sunrise to sunset on August 17, 2012. And I urge everyone participating in the events commemorating this 150th anniversary to practice not only remembrance, but also reconciliation.
Thank you, John, for bringing us those words from the governor. As I stated earlier, history is not always perfect, and it's not always perfectly told. Organizations such as the Norway Lake Lutheran Historical Association try extremely hard to present the facts as we know them at the time. Sometimes these facts disagree, depending on the speaker, the reader, or the translation from Norska Svenska, or the memory of the teller. This does not make them wrong, but it does make for a challenge to determine which is the most accurate in which to put your stock. At the end of the day, you sometimes have to go with what you have, and then be flexible if a better documented version comes along. We ask your forbearance in accepting that we've reported here as it was based on the best information that we had. Today we commemorate what has occurred here and at Munson Lake or the West Lake settlements in 1862. This is not the first time that such commemorations have occurred. I believe in 1912 there was a similar program held near the Isle of Refuge. Then 13 years later, the first of many commemorations were held by Munson Lake. Rather than have me talk about them, I'd like to ask our resident historian of the Norway Lake Lutheran Historical Association, Mr. Marlon Henjum, historian laureate, to come and speak to us. Marlon Henjum, formerly of Henjum Lake, located just to the south of here, about a mile and a half, Marlon, in Artenter Township. He's now currently resides at Games Lake. He'll give us a little history and insight into the association at Munson Lake. Please note that Marlon and I had the privilege of visiting for several hours with Mr. Solis in Kirkhoven about this sunburn. With that, Marlon?
Sounds to me like Jeff's the one that's been out in the sun, not all those people way back there. So I'm glad Jeff said what he did about you make the best of what you got, because we have something in our bulletin today that was just found recently from a Munson Lake document. And yesterday I was visiting with Ron and Marianne Peterson, who are regular and loyal members, and there's a glaring oversight there with regard to the Peterson brothers are not mentioned. So this list that we found it's the first list any of us had seen of a list of the Norway Lake Isle of Refugee people, but it obviously needs some work yet. So if you notice that too, I know there's some Peterson relatives here. We apologize for that, and we will see what we can do to find out what really happened there. So my purpose today is to talk about the Munson Lake Memorial Association. It was one hot Sunday last month, my wife and I decided to pay a visit to Munson Lake State Park. I hadn't physically been inside that park since I was a young boy, and used to go over there and we played cowboys and Indians with my cousin Carlton Nelson, who's here, and his brother Lowell. They lived just up the road a little bit. As you can imagine, the picnic shelter at that time made an amazing fort. It was likely also a hot Sunday like that on August 20th, 1926, 86 years ago tomorrow, that a man named Ole Ellingbo was walking to services at Munson Lake Lutheran. As he walked through the woods past the cellar hole where the Broberg cabin had stood, he began to think about the events that occurred there on August 20th of 1862. The idea came to Ole Ellingbo that this historic place should be remembered by future generations. He brought his idea to the members of the Munson Lake Lutheran Church, which is where he was headed for services, as well as the surrounding community, and a year later, roughly October 21st, 1927, the Munson Lake Memorial Association was established and the park was dedicated, as long ago as 1927. One of the reasons I wanted to revisit the park also was because of this program today, but also because I was awed by something else that I had discovered, what I consider to be original history that you rarely run into, and I know a lot of you have seen it too, but it's this book that I carried up here, and it's almost falling apart. But it came from a few years ago when our original secretary, Orland Mankel, passed away. His kids were kind enough to give us a box of documents and papers and so forth, and in that box was this old notebook, which is really just a catalog for heavy equipment. How that got in the Mankel house, I'm not sure, Kurt, but at any rate, someone had taken that as a catalog, and in there had pasted pictures from all the newspaper articles about the Munson Lake celebrations from 1927, the very first one, all the way up to 1941, when there was a break and the celebrations were not held during the World War II. But it's fabulous. And the newspaper articles in those days, a lot of the speeches were even printed verbatim in the paper. Nowadays you probably get a little summary, you know, but this is great original history. If you run into that in some chest or going through someone's affairs or whatever, that's good stuff. I know a lot of the old-timers used to keep obituaries pasted in books. I've seen a number of them from a generation or two above me, and they can be very valuable for people like me who are interested in that stuff, and others as well. But Orland's family gave us that, and it caught my attention. And I should also give a plug to, if you like local history, a valuable source is a website that was developed by Carolyn Sawinski, Orland's daughter. And it's simple. It's www.mankel.org if you have internet connections. And it's full of local history stuff that Orland has accumulated over the years and passed on to his family. So it's a good place to look if you're interested in Norway Lake history. So, to keep my comments brief like I said I would, and this has been a long afternoon, but I want to talk to you about some of the things that caught my eye on the Munson Lake celebrations over the year. One of the newspapers said they were wildly popular. And let me give you an example of how popular they were. 1927, the first year, the attendance was estimated at 10,000 people. We don't have 1,000 here today. I don't know what, 150, 200 maybe? 10,000. 1934 was estimated between 10 and 12,000. In 37 and 39, they started to count the cars instead of the people. And in 39, they counted 2,500 cars. We wouldn't be able to park 2,500 cars, even if we had the rest of Rogers pasture. At 4 per car, they figured that was 10,000 people. And in 1958, which of course was the Minnesota Centennial year, there were 15,000 people that attended Munson Lake Park in 1958. So they were wildly popular. And in case you think this program's getting a little too long, let me give you an example of what went on at the Munson Lake, a typical Munson Lake celebration in 1933. Service began at 10:30 in the morning with a worship service with guest preachers. Preachers, plural. You know what that means. I see Ralph Olson sitting back there. He'd probably understand. And musicians. At noon there was a picnic dinner. I think most people brought their own picnic lunches. However, there were lunch wagons on the grounds. At 12:30 they scheduled a procession to the historic spots. They went around and visited the Broberg cabin site and the site of the mass grave and so forth. Was done several years. 1:15 was the afternoon session, and it was with music, singing, and of course speeches. And they had a lot of speeches, plus a lot of musical groups, memorial choruses, Appleton Municipal Band, Starbuck Male Quartet. And after all that, before that was a pageant at 2:30 called the American Epic. It was in 12 acts with the Munson Lake Memorial Chorus, the Appleton Municipal Band, and the Starbuck Male Quartet. So it was a 12-act pageant at 2:30. Followed by a concert by the Appleton Municipal Band playing 9 classical and popular numbers. They were ambitious. Another thing caught my eye was the different bands that played, and they weren't high school bands. They were, one example, just 1938, Raymond had the concert band there. They had 37 members, and they were adults. They weren't young kids from high school. Fabulous. Speakers, we have to mention speakers. Just blew my mind, considering how hard it can be to get speakers, even though I think we had one of the best today at 10 and 30. There were, a 1951 program featured Senator Hubert Humphrey. They, in the past, had 3 United States senators, 5 congressmen, 7 governors, including Floyd B. Olson, Elmer Benson, Carl Rovag, La Follette from Wisconsin, and Harold Stassen. Harold Stassen was a very popular governor. He was scheduled to be there in 1939, and he was late. 6 p.m. he still had not showed up. But an airplane flying over Munson Lake State Park in those days probably got the attention of people, and people actually came back to hear the governor give his speech, those that hadn't left. 18 state officials were there, 1 ambassador, 5 synod bishops, 7 college presidents, 2 military colonels, 1 major, 32 ordained pastors, 1 Indian woman who was the daughter of Little Crow, and in 1941 the president of Norway, Storting, in exile, which was World War II, and the Norwegian Parliament or Congress like ours had apparently been exiled from Norway and was in the United States, and the president of that Storting appeared here at Munson Lake. We all know that fabulous programs such as I've described just don't happen without a lot of work and worry. I noticed in the 51 program there were 15 active committees in the association, and 155 people were served on those committees. Their dues were only $1 for a lifetime membership, so we know there was not a huge budget with which to work. In that same year, one of the new members was E.W. Solis, who I believe first arrived in Kirkhoven that same year and headed up the association for several years. To those dedicated individuals who served in the Munson Lake Memorial Association from 1926 to its final program in the early 1990s, we owe our gratitude and appreciation for striving to preserve and share our heritage with generations to come. I doubt that there were any historical gatherings in Minnesota history over such a long period of time that can compare with those of the Munson Lake Memorial Association. Finally, if you ever were a member of that association, the Memorial Association, served as an officer, or on a committee, or participated in a program, please raise your, I'd ask you to stand, but it's too hard to stand in with these chairs. Please raise your hand. If you were ever a member, an officer, participated in a program, 2 is all, yeah? Charles Shuck, where are you? You said you sang in a quartet and whatever.
Ann Black was one, and she played for us.
Okay, and the Gandred brothers. I thought there really would be maybe more than that, but okay. But raise your hand so that we here may pay you tribute for your as well as those who. Yeah.
Philip still was the last president.
Oh, okay, good. Philip Gandred is the current president of the association, right? So those of you who participated in the past and those who are no longer with us, we extend our tribute to you, and let's everyone give the men that have been here a round of applause. Thank you, Jeff.
Puck for day, Marlon.
Yep.
And thanks to each of our speakers today. We hope sincerely that each of you have come to have a little better understanding of the important bit of history that occurred in its formerly wild place, known as Norway Lake and West Lake parishes. And that we hope that you think that we met the original goal that we set out when we started, to give you a chance to have just a little bit of a peek into your history. If your appetite is now whetted to explore more, please look at the local historical societies. They have a huge amount of information down there. If you haven't been there, go. And it's not, they have a sign, turn your cell phone off, but other than that, it's really not a bad place to stop in and visit. And you've asked them, they can help you. If you want to find out about your families, it's surprising the wealth of knowledge that is there. Take a little time and look on the internet. It's amazing if you haven't done that, what you can find by typing in simple things like your name. Sometimes maybe you don't want to know what happens when you type in your name. But please do that and read some of the books that are out there. There's a lot of books on the Dakota Wars, but there's books on a lot of the local history as well. And functions such as this, a couple of years ago we published a little brochure with each of the early settlers in it. Well, those kinds of documents are all resident either at an interpretive center like this or at a local historical society. So with that, I want to thank you again for everybody for coming. Earl's got a few closing remarks. We're glad that you were willing to rise to the idea. Earl, thank you, sir.
Well, I surely join Jeff in thanking our presenters today for reading those pieces or letting us into those stories. And I'd also like to thank our Master of Ceremonies, Jeff Johnson. He's worked harder than any of us. Thank you very much. Just a little about our association. We do operate entirely on donations. Some 6-7 years ago we went through a grant application and we didn't get it and it wasn't that much fun. So we found out there would have been quite a few strings attached, so it's very nice to be able to operate on donations without the strings attached. We have a 12-member board of directors. We meet about 10 times a year and we work through our problems and our finances and decide what needs to be done next. And we have our annual meeting in January, and at that time we put out a short letter report to give the account of what happened in the past year. So I think we have most of your names, and you'll probably be getting that letter. It's really good to see this crowd of people here today. Good grief, look at this. Anybody get a count? I hope so. Yes. I'd like to ask you for a moment of silence while I read the names of our association members who have passed since the last meeting. They are as follows: Rose Austin, Donald Bast, Beatrice Handy, Reverend Fred Hagan, Rolf Hauge, Norma Henjum, Lorraine Kossi, Elmer Moe, Jean Ransom, Hazel Scary, and Orville Stye. If we have missed someone, we apologize. Anyone know of any others that we missed? Thank you very much. What next, Jeff? What's up next?
Coffee. But one thing though, you notice, and Marlon.
I made a big boo-boo when I was talking up there, and there's so many people here that know who I may have been talking about. It was not Ralph Olson. It was Ralph Peterson. Sorry about that, Ralph.
Everyone's entitled to one mistake. One thing I want to point out. Earl just read the names of those who have left the organization in the last year. They've gone a little better place. But just think about that. That means we have room for about 12 more new members. Isn't that right?
That's absolutely
The bathrooms are in the interpretive center. If you want to take a look at the Knutson cabin, you're more than welcome. We don't have any organized tours, but it's open. You just go down to the driveway and you can drive in and hopefully get turned around and look back over your feet or somebody else's feet. But please do that. There's a kiosk there. There's all kinds of interpretive material in there as well. There's a light lunch right underneath the trees over to the south, out in the sun. And come back in and enjoy it. Visit with your neighbors. We sometimes forget to visit with our neighbors as much as we ought to. But just as importantly, visit with those in your families that you may not have seen for all these long years. And we want to thank these folks coming from as far away as they did to speak to us today. We really appreciate that. It's not often that we get people to come long distances. Is that not correct?
That's true. That's true.
So thank you very much.
My wife reminds me that we do have some memorabilia for sale at the table over by the cabin. So we got a couple of books, some refrigerator magnets, plates and such over there at very reasonable prices.
Oh, good. Email probably is the easiest.